What if the moment they started leaving was not the day they stopped replying, not the day they went cold, not even the day they finally walked away, but weeks before that, while they were still smiling at you, still answering, still showing up like nothing had changed? That is the part almost nobody sees. Because when someone deeply sensitive begins to shut down, it does not happen with noise. It happens in silence. It happens behind the eyes, beneath the words, inside a private emotional system that has already started making a decision long before the outside world notices it. And once that inner shift begins, everything changes. The energy changes. The warmth changes. The access changes. You may still think the bond is alive, while inside them, the doors are already closing one by one. So stay with me, because this is where most people get it completely wrong. They assume distance starts with anger. It usually does not. They assume withdrawal starts with one big betrayal. It often does not. They assume there will be a warning, a dramatic goodbye, one final speech that explains everything. Many times there is no speech at all. Just a quiet turning point, a slow fade, a final inner conclusion. And once that conclusion locks in, the person you thought would always understand, you may become the one person you can no longer reach. If you miss this pattern, you will keep asking what changed. But if you understand it, you will see that nothing changed suddenly. The signs were there. The sequence was there. The ending had already started. The biggest misunderstanding is this: deeply emotional people are not slow to react. They are slow to conclude. That difference matters more than most people realize. Many people react to what just happened. They hear one harsh sentence, they feel one cold moment, and they respond right away. But someone who lives through deep perception does something else first. They watch, they compare, they track what keeps happening under the surface. They are not just hearing words. They are checking whether the words match the tone, the timing, the intention, and the energy behind them. They are not just seeing actions. They are studying consistency. They notice what repeats. They notice what shifts. They notice what suddenly disappears. And while all of this is happening, they may still look calm, still kind, still patient, still available. That is what fools people. On the outside, nothing seems broken. On the inside, a profile is being built quietly, carefully, piece by piece, one interaction at a time, one silence at a time, one strange feeling they cannot ignore at a time. In the back of their mind, one question keeps running again and again. Is this a moment or is this a pattern? And for a long time, they do not rush that answer. They give room, they give chances, they let time reveal the truth. Not because they are confused, but because they are precise. They do not want to judge too early. They do not want to punish one bad day. They want clarity, real clarity. But once that clarity arrives, everything speeds up. And if you blink, you miss the exact second their heart begins to step back. There is a hidden line that changes the whole story. Before that line, they are still interpreting, still trying to understand, still giving the benefit of the doubt. They are asking themselves if maybe you are stressed, maybe distracted, maybe afraid, maybe carrying pain you do not know how to express. They are filling gaps, translating mixed signals, hoping what feels off is temporary, but then something happens. The pattern repeats enough times, the emotional math stops changing. The inconsistency becomes consistent, and the moment that happens, confusion collapses. This is the threshold, the point where they stop asking, why is this happening? And start realizing this is how it works. That sentence is small, but it changes everything. Because once the mind sees something as structural instead of accidental, the heart begins to detach from it. A repeated pattern no longer feels personal. It starts to feel fixed, predictable, built in. And people can tolerate pain for a long time when they still believe it is random, temporary, or repairable. But when pain becomes predictable, the nervous system stops calling it love and starts calling it danger. This is where emotional investment begins to drain out. Not with drama, not with revenge, with clarity. And clarity creates distance faster than conflict ever could. Watch closely here, because this part matters. Once they see that effort is conditional, presence is unstable, and warmth only appears when convenient, they stop trying to decode you. They stop hoping the next moment will be different. Their system quietly labels the connection as non-viable, not imperfect, not wounded, non-viable. And once that label settles in, protection begins automatically. This shift does not happen from one argument or one disappointing day. It usually builds through repeated inner signals. 3 of those signals matter most. The first is emotional inconsistency. This is not just moodiness. It is unstable presence, warm one day, distant the next. Open when it benefits you, cold when it requires effort. Kind in words, absent in action. That instability forces the other person into constant emotional monitoring. They start scanning your voice, your pauses, your small changes, trying to figure out which version of you they are going to meet today. And that kind of inner vigilance is exhausting. More exhausting than direct conflict sometimes. Because at least conflict is clear, unpredictability is not. The second signal is unreturned depth. They keep showing up with sincerity, attention, real feeling, real listening, and over time they notice that the emotional weight is not shared equally. One person is carrying the bond. One person is doing the emotional labor. One person keeps reaching deeper while the other stays on the surface. At first they excuse it. Then they shrink a little. Then they share less. The third signal is energetic drain. Every interaction begins to cost more than it gives. They leave conversations tired. They leave explanations emptier. They leave meetings with you feeling heavier instead of clearer. And this is important, so do not miss it. These signs do not trigger a sudden explosion. They trigger quiet recalibration. Less openness, less access, less emotional priority. The outside still looks normal. The inside is already changing. Emotional inconsistency is often the first crack because trust does not break only through cruelty. It also breaks through unpredictability. When someone never knows where they stand with you, the bond becomes unstable even if there is no open fight. Think about how this feels in real life. One day they get your full attention. The next day they feel invisible. One week you are deeply affectionate. The next week you act bothered by their existence. You say, I care, but your pattern says only when it is easy. You say, I'm here, but your energy says, not really. Sensitive people do not just listen to language. They listen to alignment. They measure whether your words and your emotional reality actually match. And when they do not match for too long, the mind starts protecting itself. This is why people are often shocked when someone leaves after nothing major happened. Something major did happen. It just did not happen in one scene. It happened in repetition. It happened through mixed signals. It happened through 100 tiny fractures that never got repaired. And because those fractures are small, the person causing them often ignores them. But the person feeling them does not ignore them. They absorb them. They stack them. They carry them until one day the system says enough. And here is the hardest part. By the time you start acting consistent again, they may already be past the point where consistency can rebuild trust. Because trust is not restored by one good week after months of confusion. Once their nervous system learns to expect instability, even your better moments can feel temporary. And if they start feeling temporary, the bond begins to lose its hold. Then comes the pain of one-sided depth. This is where the connection starts thinning from the inside. At first, they offer understanding freely. They listen carefully. They notice what you do not say. They try to make space for your silence, your stress, your confusion, even your flaws. But over time, they notice something important. The emotional bridge only seems to work in one direction. They can hold your complexity, but you do not really hold theirs. They can make room for your truth, but you do not fully make room for theirs. They can sense your shifts before you speak, but when they begin to fade, you barely notice. That imbalance hurts in a very quiet way. It is not always dramatic enough to argue about. It is simply lonely. And loneliness inside a close connection is one of the fastest roads to emotional withdrawal. Little by little, what was once naturally shared becomes carefully filtered. They stop giving you the raw version of what they feel. They stop showing you the most personal parts of their inner world. Not because they want to play games, but because their system has learned that deep offering without deep return is a losing exchange. Then the energetic drain gets stronger. They notice that after talking to you, they feel scattered. After helping you, they feel empty. After trying again, they feel smaller. And this is where the body enters the conversation. The mind may still want to understand. The heart may still remember love. But the body begins to say, this costs too much. This is not sustainable. And once the body says that enough times, the exit has already begun. When withdrawal starts, it rarely looks dramatic. It follows a sequence. First comes emotional reduction. This is the early stage, and it is easy to miss if you only pay attention to surface behavior. They still text back. They still sit with you. They still laugh sometimes. But the depth is no longer flowing the same way. The most personal thoughts stay inside. The emotional transparency begins to narrow. What used to come out freely now comes out measured, edited, controlled. They are still present but not fully reachable. And because there is no big confrontation, many people assume everything is fine. It is not fine. It is quieter. That is different. They begin protecting the parts of themselves that once reached for you without fear. They no longer bring every hurt to you. They no longer explain every internal shift. They no longer let you see the entire landscape of what they feel. This stage is subtle, but it is massive. Because once emotional access starts shrinking, the bond loses warmth long before it loses contact. And if you are not paying attention, you may mistake politeness for closeness. You may mistake response for connection. You may mistake presence for intimacy. Stay with this, because this is exactly how people get blindsided. They think the relationship is still alive because the routine is still alive. But routine is not the same as emotional openness. Habit is not the same as trust. Contact is not the same as closeness. And when someone starts guarding their inner world after once sharing it openly, that is not random. That is the beginning of the fade. The first layer of disappearance happens inside long before it can be seen outside. Then comes cognitive detachment. And this stage is even quieter. This is where you stop occupying their mind the way you used to. They no longer replay every conversation trying to figure out what you meant. They no longer overanalyze your tone, your timing, your distance, your mixed signals. The mental energy that once circled around you starts to pull back. That is huge, because when someone is still mentally invested, even pain keeps the bond alive. The overthinking, the hoping, the questioning, the trying to decode it all, that is still connection. It may be painful connection, but it is connection. Cognitive detachment ends that cycle. The mind becomes neutral. Silence stops feeling loaded. Delayed replies stop feeling mysterious. Your behavior stops feeling like a puzzle they need to solve. They are no longer searching for hidden meaning because the need to understand has dissolved. And once that happens, something powerful shifts. The emotional weather around you clears. Not because everything was resolved, but because they no longer need resolution from you. That need was one of the final chords holding the dynamic together. When it snaps, the space inside them becomes calmer, less drama, less obsession, less inner noise. This is why people are often stunned when someone leaves without explaining enough. The truth is, the explanation process already ended inside them. They spent weeks or months trying to understand, trying to fix, trying to see the best. By the time they stop talking about it, they are not indifferent. They are done translating pain into hope. And once that translation stops, the silence feels normal instead of alarming. That is when the relationship becomes emotionally ghosted before it is physically gone. The final stage is behavioral distance. This is when the outside finally starts matching the inside. Communication becomes shorter, more functional, less warm. The emotional color drains out of the exchange. They still answer, but the attachment behind the answer is no longer there. They still show up sometimes, but it feels optional now, not intentional. They do not lean in the same way. They do not reach the same way. They do not initiate with the same softness or hunger or care. And because the shift is gradual, many people keep telling themselves it is temporary. They say maybe they are tired, maybe stressed, maybe just going through something. And yes, sometimes that is true. But when behavioral distance arrives after emotional reduction and cognitive detachment, it means the inner exit is already complete. This is what makes it so powerful. The person is still visible, still around, still technically present in your life, yet access has already been removed. The connection has lost influence. No screaming match is needed. No final breakup scene is required. No closure speech has to happen. By the time physical distance shows up clearly, The psychological exit often happened long before. And this is the part that hits hardest. Most people respond only when behavior changes. But the real ending started before behavior ever made it obvious. It started in perception, in pattern recognition, in internal fatigue. In the moment, their system realized that staying open was costing too much. If you wait for the obvious signs, you are already late. The visible ending is just the echo of a decision that was made in silence. And when the disconnect becomes complete, they do not just leave a person. They leave a version of themselves. This is where the transformation becomes deeper than the relationship itself. The version that once existed in that bond was often built on overgiving, over-explaining, overreaching, overextending emotional capacity in the hope that more understanding would create more harmony. That version kept choosing connection over boundaries, peace over self-protection, patience over self-respect. It tried longer, bent further, held more, excused more. But once the inner shift happens, that old version starts to die off. And that is why the ending can feel so final. It is not only about losing faith in another person. It is about outgrowing the self that kept accepting what drained them. This is not simple sadness. It is internal restructuring. Once they become aware of how much of themselves they abandoned just to keep the connection alive, returning starts to feel unnatural, not impossible because of pride. Unnatural because it would require becoming that older, smaller version again, and growth makes old shapes hard to fit into. This matters more than people think, because many assume that if enough time passes, familiarity will pull the person back. But familiarity is not stronger than identity change. If someone has rebuilt themselves around stronger boundaries, clearer perception, and more self-trust, then going back into the same emotional pattern does not feel like love. It feels like self-betrayal. And once a person links a connection with self-betrayal, the bond loses its power to call them home. That is why some absences feel absolute. The connection did not just end. The person who used to survive inside it no longer exists. After that, even if the old dynamic reappears, the perception has changed too much to recreate the past. The voice may be familiar. The memories may still carry emotional weight. The chemistry may flicker for a second. But perception now sees what it could not fully see before. The pattern cannot be unseen. The cost cannot be unfelt. The old confusion cannot fully come back because clarity has already replaced it. And once perception changes at that level, behavior follows. People often think emotional memory is enough to rebuild connection. It usually is not. Emotional memory can make someone nostalgic. It can make them remember the good moments. It can make them briefly wonder what could have been. But memory does not erase understanding. Once they know how the dynamic worked, once they know what it did to their nervous system, once they know how much of themselves they had to abandon to keep it going, the mind will not easily let the heart walk back in blindly. This is why return ends before it even begins. Not because the feeling is fake, not because the memories are gone, but because identity now demands consistency. And consistency means they cannot reconnect with something that only works if they ignore what they now know. That kind of return would require denial. It would require shrinking. It would require pretending that old pain was not real just because the present moment feels soft again. And once someone has learned to trust their inner alarm instead of silencing it, that kind of pretending becomes very hard to do. So if their absence feels final, it is often because it is built on resolution, not temporary emotion. Resolution is much harder to reverse than sadness. Here is the part most people notice too late. When they detach, they do not lose power. They get it back. While they are emotionally invested, so much of their energy is focused outward. They are reading moods, measuring shifts, keeping balance, trying to understand, trying to soothe, trying to maintain the bond, even when it costs them. Their awareness is tied up in the other person. Their emotional system is constantly responding. But the moment detachment starts, that whole pattern reverses. Attention comes back inward. Energy comes back inward. Focus comes back inward. And when that happens, influence disappears. Because control only exists where emotional access still exists. If you can still trigger them, confuse them, destabilize them, pull them into emotional loops, then some part of them is still hooked. But once those hooks stop working, the leverage is gone. No more reactive openings, no more begging for clarity, no more desperate need for explanation, no more internal dependence on what you do next. This is what makes them feel untouchable in the end. Not cold, not heartless, not numb, regulated, self-contained, clear, whole again. And people often misread that calm as cruelty because they remember the older version, the one who cared visibly, explained endlessly, and kept the emotional door open long after it should have closed. But this calmer version is not cruel, it is recovered. It is what happens when someone stops leaking energy into a bond that no longer deserves it. Watch this closely because this is the reversal no one expects. The person who once seemed most emotionally affected can become the most emotionally unreachable once the inner decision is complete. That is why the disappearance can feel so absolute. It is not usually a reaction to one last wound. It is the result of a long internal settling, a point where the chaos finally becomes clear enough to release, a point where pain no longer creates attachment because understanding has ended the loop. They do not argue because arguing keeps energy tied to the dynamic. They do not over-explain because over-explaining belongs to the older version of them that still hoped words could repair what patterns had already revealed. They do not negotiate space the same way anymore because they are no longer asking for permission to protect themselves. They leave inwardly first. The outer exit just follows. And if you are hearing this and thinking that sounds too quiet to be real, that is exactly why it is missed so often. Real endings are not always loud. Some of the deepest endings happen in plain sight, through less sharing, less mental replay, less emotional reach, less desire to be understood by the same person who kept misunderstanding. And if this feels uncomfortably accurate, that is because many people only value emotional availability after they have already exhausted it. They keep assuming care will renew itself on demand. It does not always work that way. Once someone has reached peace without the connection, chaos no longer looks romantic. It looks expensive, so they stop reaching back, not because they never cared, because they cared deeply enough to finally stop bleeding for it. And when that lesson fully lands, they do not need revenge. They do not need the last word. They do not even need closure in the old way. Their closure is the clarity itself. So if you are trying to understand why someone once so open became so unreachable, look past the final silence and study the sequence that came before it. Look at the repeated instability. Look at the one-sided depth. Look at the energetic cost. Look at the emotional reduction, the mental detachment, the quiet behavioral distance that appeared before the visible ending. That is where the truth lives. And if you are the one who has been carrying too much for too long, this is your reminder that your system was never weak for needing peace. It was wise. It was tracking patterns. It was trying to protect what your hope kept trying to hand away. Sometimes the strongest thing a person does is not speaking louder. It is seeing clearly. Sometimes the deepest act of self-respect is not making someone understand. It is accepting that they already showed you enough. And once that acceptance becomes real, the need to stay begins to die. That is the moment everything changes. Not outside first, inside first, quietly, permanently. So the next time someone seems patient for longer than you expected, do not assume they feel nothing. They may be observing. The next time someone still shows up after being disappointed, do not assume the bond is safe. They may still be deciding. And the next time someone goes silent without a dramatic ending, do not assume the ending came out of nowhere. Chances are it did not. The final disappearance was just the first visible sign of a process that had already been unfolding in silence for a very long time. And once that process reaches clarity, there is often nothing left to debate. Only distance, only peace, only the quiet power of someone who finally chose themselves.